afternoon, all the participants. I think we can begin now. We have around 17 participants in this meeting, including the organizers. Though we had kept it open for all, we had given the option for participants to skip this session because it is exclusively for those participants who have some doubts and for those whose questions remained unattended during the talks. I'm very happy that we also have with us Professor Vinod Jha. He was the first speaker in this program, and he has also taken out time to clarify doubts if any participant has. And slowly, we will take up the questions that we have received on day-to-day basis. So we'll begin with day 1 and lecture 1, and we'll read out the questions and discuss them. You are also free to participate. In case there are some questions that you have not asked during the program and you would like to ask now, please feel free for that also. So let's begin. The first question that we received from Shri Krishna Vaidya, that was, what care should be taken while translating culture? This is from day 1, and I hope Shri Krishna Vaidya is available here. If not, then also let us discuss the question. Let us understand that many scholars have discussed this issue in details, and they have mentioned that transfer of a structure of a sentence into another language will not make a very desirable translation. The understanding of the text in the source language is very important, and it is equally important to express the same in the target language, which would not be possible unless the cultural aspects, cultural nuances are taken into full consideration. So that way, the question that Shri Krishna Vaidya has asked is self-explanatory, but how a translator strategizes his or her act is important. Whether you start doing a kind of culture studies when you are translating two languages and you study the two concerned cultures in details, or what other strategies you can adopt. In that context, it is important to take into consideration the idiomatic expressions, the phrasal expressions, and certain other proverbs in the source text as well as in the target text. If that are taken into consideration, you might agree with me on the fact that many of the cultural encodings are there in our cultural knowledge is there in the form of proverbs, idioms, phrasal verbs, and certain other collocations. So these are like seemingly very simple structures, but they have a lot of information encoded in that. So my suggestion to any translator who is interested to know the cultural aspects is that they should focus on these linguistic matters, the collocations, including phrasal verbs, idioms, and proverbs, and then approach the things, approach the text. This is from my side. Any other participant who wishes to add to it is also welcome. Please. If not, then we'll move on to the next question. That is from Sneha Gupta. And she says that if automation of translation is good or bad, or it should have been, is automation of translation good or bad for translation as a human skill developed since a long period? So this question is very interesting because we all know that translation has existed for a long time, probably as long as language itself or languages themselves are there, because it was always that there were several languages and the interactions were happening. In that case, translation has been an enabling factor always. But the point is, today we have a situation in which technology has advanced to an extent that we are expecting automated translation also. What is the shape and size of that? How authentic it is? how reliable these translations are? These are some of the questions based on which Sneha has asked this question of how this is going to affect the human translation. This is an interesting question in many ways, one of which is that when writing evolved, when writing evolved, at that time also, or when print technology came, at that time also, there were apprehensions about how these technologies would affect the behavior of language and communication or communicative activities. So whenever a new technology comes, we have our own apprehensions, we have our own doubts related to how this would affect the human communication and language system. So based on that, if we also take into consideration how today's automated systems, including the machine translation systems, are performing, we'll be surprised to see that it is performing to some extent for major languages, performing well, but then at the same time, it is not fully reliable. Then what happens is we have a choice between human translation and machine translation. But if we observe the matter very carefully and we analyze it slightly more critically, we'll notice that these are neither completely human translation nor completely machine translation. Rather, we have machine-aided human translation. The moment we take this into consideration, we understand that human participation, human involvement in the translation activity is there. It is not compromised at all. Yes, dictionaries, other lexical resources, various other tools have been beneficial. They are enablers to some extent, and for languages in which machine systems are available, we are benefiting. But then this is not going to replace human translation or human beings completely. I can give you a number of examples. A number of examples you can also come across. If we say a word like holy shit, or I say a sentence like holy shit, or if I say all the best, can you say all the best in your languages? If I ask you to say all the best in the languages that you know, especially Indian languages, you will be a little flummoxed and you'll see that you don't have an equivalent. So how do you say all the best? Or for that matter, some other expressions, regular expressions, day-to-day expressions of day-to-day use are there, which would be very difficult to translate in Indian languages. So in that case, what I feel is, though machine translation is advancing in a significant pace, human translation is still relevant and human beings' participation cannot be completely ignored.
Sir, in that case, I would like to add,
Yes.
as far as the current translation industry we observe, the major requirement for human intervention is only for the legal, medical, and such kind of fields where they have to have authentication that the translation has been verified through the human eyes and human understanding. Rest of the fields, they are very easily replaced by the automated translations, unfortunately.
I seek to disagree with you, Sneha. I seek to disagree with you for the fact that you have highlighted one domain that is legal. I agree with you on that. But then what would you say about medicine? What would you say about academics? What would you say about several other domains where appropriateness of translation or authenticity or validity of translation is equally important? So my view is that instead of specifying a particular domain, we should say pragmatic knowledge, the socio-cultural and political knowledge for a particular language is important for the translators. So it is important that the translators are taking into consideration the pragmatic aspects. Pragmatic aspects refer to that level of language which talks about use in context. So it is not just about structure of sentences or words or just words and meanings. Rather, it is about the context in which language is used. So context becomes very important.
That is right.
Uttara Dorai Rajan, you have raised your hand. Can you ask your
Yes, sir.
question?
Yeah, actually,
Yes.
I would like to agree, especially me and another participant here, Mani. We are translating worksheets, science worksheets for children of Homi Baba Center. So what happens is, no, only with the help the same word, because for different age group we are giving the science worksheets. We are catering it for 7th standard or 8th standard. What happens is we really need to use our human brains. Machine translation doesn't help us much in this case. Though with words from Google or anywhere or virtual dictionaries, we need to think of what a child is thinking, and then we are trying to translate those science worksheets. So when we want to pick up age appropriate or context appropriate or culture appropriate words, I feel human intervention is very necessary. I thought I would just add that point.
I agree with you. I also agree with Sneha for the fact that we are moving in a particular direction. If you take into consideration how Google Translate was performing 5 years ago and how it is performing today, you will agree with me on the fact that it has improved considerably.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
a lot of translators are making use of it now for the languages in which it is available. Now, what happens is, as the corpus is growing with time, the performance of these machine systems is also improving. So we can very safely say that in coming years, maybe in 5 to 10 years time, we will be in a position to even rely on machine translations. But the fact that translation has to be culturally and pragmatically appropriate cannot be ignored. So that is why human beings.
Yes.
All right. I would like to inform you all that Professor Vinod Jha is also with us here, and there was a question related to his talk. So we can take up that question first, so that he addresses that question, and then we move on to other interactive points. Is that okay?
Yes.
So let us take his question, the question that had come to him first. That was related to, that was by Ramesh Ingale, and his question was to throw some more light on feminist theory of translation. If Professor Jha is there, I'll request him to discuss feminist perspective on translation. Over to Professor Vinod Jha.
Thank you very much, Tariq, for giving me this opportunity to speak to such august audience, and also good afternoon to all of you, to the NTN team and all the participants. In fact, I was speaking on the problems and challenges of literary translation on that day, and by way of introducing the subject of translation, because I was the first speaker, I also introduced the basics of translation. And in that process, I also spoke about the feminist theory of translation. And that is a very interesting story about how feminism and translation became allies, became friends in me. That's a very interesting story. The translation and feminism, the advocacy of the rights of women. Translation is secondary to the original. A woman is secondary to male. And translation and woman, a female, became partners in me. And that was the beginning of that intense interest in translation by the feminists, especially in the 1960s. 1960s was the era of the rise of radical feminism, when feminists were desperately looking for any space, any method, any means to further their aims of establishing their identities, their demands, protesting, critiquing, and in that process, in fact, feminism was trying to emerge from the shadows of earlier liberalism and socialist school, and they were trying to be proactive in their aims. translation, surprisingly, was also emerging from the shadows of being subservient to the original. And that was the time when, in 1970, that famous translation by Gregory Rabassa of 100 Years of Solitude, that well-known book by Mark is Mark is, his translation. And also, Mark is a statement that the translated text of Gregory Rabassa was better than the original. And that was establishing that space for a translation, and this was the time when feminism was rising. Feminists found in translation a very important, very helpful ally, and that was the beginning of the feminist theory of translation. And I'll speak for just a few minutes because this is a very fast-growing and developing field in academics, feminist theory of translation. But I'll speak a few lines more about it. I just want to say that it is a very interesting field how feminists found in translation a great friend, a sort of redeemer, a sort of liberator. The early proponents of radical feminism, they discovered in translation a shared heritage of double inferiority. As I told you, translators and women have historically been weaker figures in their respective hierarchies. Translators are handmaidens to authors, women inferior to men. And that ensured that pact between translation. And at the same time, many philosophers, the emerging literary theory and new perspectives on language, and Derrida particularly, that proponent of deconstruction, when he was speaking about translation being an act of transforming the language, and also that in the original text there is always that hidden other text that provides the potential for the meaning, hidden meaning that can be achieved, that can be manifested in translation. So all these factors help to the rise of this feminist theory of translation. And also we have many other factors, cultural factor also in philosophy, like Simone de Beauvoir, who had in 1949 said that a woman is not born, but a woman is made. And that statement, such a powerful statement, although not taken very seriously, but after 20 years, in the 1970s, this translation coming to the aid of the feminists, and there was a trigger. There was a trigger in the Canadian city of Quebec, where a few translators, female translators, took up this act of translation as a method, as a weapon to transform, to try to re-establish the identity of a female identity, and then critiquing, restructuring the whole perspective of maybe philosophical, cultural, and political, and that led to that rise, a rapid rise of feminist theory of translation. There have been many areas or denominations in which this feminist theory of translation is now known. Some of these have a common theme, the undercurrent, a common theme, but they have different denominations. As I can read out a few names, like gender and translation, feminist translation, women and translation, and while some others are used more limited translation of gender, translating gender, gender in translation. All these denominations are the outcome of that feminist theory of translation. And then it's emerging, it's rising, and I would request some of you to take up this domain of research in feminist theory and translation. There are many, and when you go into the details of this domain, you will find things of much interest, new things you can discover, and you can research. Just a few words about that question. Thank you, Tabitha.
Thank you, sir. It was very insightful and very kind of you to discuss this topic in details. I hope the participants have benefited. Let us move on to the next question from the first day. And we have Ishika Roy posting two questions. The first one is, so while translating as a beginner, what should one must follow? This question is partly answered as a beginner starting a translation activity. The first thing that has to be kept in mind is not only the proficiency in the concerned languages, but also knowledge of the cultural aspects of the languages concerned. And in that context, the knowledge of pragmatics, the knowledge of appropriateness of language in a context is very important. It is of like a lot of significance. If that is there, one can become a translator. Many times you'll notice people saying that if you know two languages, you can act as a translator or as an interpreter. This is not very true. You may be bilingual, you may be proficient and functional in two languages, but to be a translator, you need to have a different kind of a skill set. And there comes the main thing. So as a translator, the knowledge of cultural aspects is of paramount importance. That is something we would like to emphasize. Then Ishika has one more question. That is, if possible, kindly suggest a book or two for beginner translators. Yes, we will suggest you some books. We will also tell you some of the recent publications when we discuss the things in the next interactive session in the next week. But before moving on to that, let me tell you, when we suggest a book, we have some choices to make. We have some options. First is like, if you are asking for a book in translation studies, then there are several subdomains within translation studies, and it would be good if we identify the subdomain and then select a book. There are some general books also. There are some books which can be called introductory books that just invite or welcome an individual into the field of translation studies. Then there are books which are called handbooks or encyclopedic books. So translation studies also has some handbooks where the accepted wisdom of or accepted knowledge of the entire enterprise of translation studies is published. So I can spell out some names here, which I think may be interesting, but there are several other books also. And we shall be discussing about books again in the next week, when we would like you to take up something. Let me tell you, Jeremy Munde has written a book called Introducing Translation Studies, Theories and Applications. So this is a very nice introductory book, which is beneficial for anyone who is a practicing translator or somebody who is just studying or beginning to study translation studies. Then Eugene Nida's work is well known across the globe. This is something that you can follow, The Theory and Practice of Translation by Eugene Nida. Then if somebody is interested in gender or feminist issues in translation, then a book called Gender in Translation is recommended. That is something that you may like to read. by Sherry Simon. And then Lawrence Venuti has published the Translation Studies Reader, which is an excellent book that covers most domains of translation studies. And these, these are like things very well researched. Then there is an interesting book by G. Steiner titled After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation. So it has focused on like language aspects or linguistic aspects of translation. Then Encyclopedia of Translation Studies is also available, published by Mona Baker. So these are some of the books which I have mentioned before you. There is a question by Dr. Vishwanandan. Do you agree reading theoretical inputs from books and or listening to long lectures in the training program can really help the actual translators when they engage in the translation, or the above for academic learning? A very good question from Dr. Vishwanandan. Thank you for the question. This question is in sync with an earlier question that Dr. Vishwanandan had asked that was related to definitions. And his question was that, are the set of definitions going to help the actual translators? So when we pose this question as a yes, no proposition, and we take a side like yes or no, we will probably not be able to reach at a very justifiable answer. So my request would be not to pose it as a yes, no question, or rather we should rephrase it and say in what ways this is going to be helpful. And when I say in what ways these things are going to be helpful, then I have already taken a side. You may say that I have taken a side. That means I'm justifying the presence of definitions and these books. Let me draw your attention to some facts. First, definitions. Why do we have definitions? Why are there so many definitions? These are perspectives. These are viewpoints. These are ideas that different scholars have taken on a given subject. Now, how does a translator benefit from that? As a matter of fact, if you pick up a translator randomly from some place and ask him, what theory did you read to translate a particular work? He may say that, look, sir, I have not read any theory. I am just translating based on the proficiency of language I have. In that case, it will look like all these theories are not going to be useful. Is that so? My point is that no. A translator translating without theories, a translator translating without knowing anything about what experts have spoken about this subject, because experts have also not spoken out of blue. They have encountered problems, and when they encountered problems at a large scale and in a recurring manner, they needed to devise something. They needed to devise something so that they are able to suggest something, and that can save time and efforts of the future translators. Why do we have theories, by the way? We have theories because theories have some predictive power. Theories allow you to predict some of the things which you have not encountered right now. So they can also help you solve a problem that is reoccurring. So you solve a problem once and you make the solution available for so many people in future also. That is why it is important for any translator and every translator to get acquainted with some theories. It is possible that the translators who are translating at the moment are basically encountering text that is of literal nature, or that is general communication, conversations, day-to-day language use, which has lesser intricacies. But the moment you have texts of higher intricacies, then there are choices, and these choices are such that you may require a lot of discussions. Now, discussions can happen today between two translators, or say a person who is commissioning the work and a person who is assigned. But the point is, these problems or the problems of this nature can occur in future also. So if these are documented properly and presented in the form of a book or talk, this can be made available to those people who are taking up the task in future. So that way it's helpful. Secondly, when we have discussions on these matters, this also allows us to think on the same topic from very different perspectives. And when these perspectives are opening, we are able to think from the way which we had not, or from the perspective that we had not taken from our own. Dr. Vishwanandan has put one more text here. It is worth quoting and adding for everyone here to Peter Newmark. Translation theory is pointless and sterile if it does not arise from problems of translation practice, from the need to stand back and reflect, to consider all the factors within the text and outside it before coming to the decision. A very nice addition, Dr. Vishwanandan. Thank you. This is a very good addition. And I have come across this viewpoint from several scholars who are also teaching translation studies. They feel that a translation studies scholar who does not translate, or a translator who does not read theory, both are at fault. So it is good to read some theory, and it is very, very important for them to examine or test the theory. So a person who is reading the theory will translate and test the validity of the theory, and a translator who is translating will benefit from the theory. So this way probably we'll be able to arrive at a solution. Let us move on to the next question. Probably on day one itself, we have M. Khalid asking, what about footnotes in translation process? Is it a good practice? This question is also very interesting because it has occurred repeatedly in several discussions. In several places, this has occurred. What should be the quantity of footnotes? Whether it should be there or not? Of course, it should be there, but the word of caution for the translators is that it should not be so much that the text is undermined, or the footnote overshadows the translation or the text itself. So this is a kind of a critical situation in which the translator has to make the best judgment and keep the footnotes to the optimum number. I would not say minimum or maximum, it should be optimum. Dr. Vishwanandan, you would like to say something? Please unmute yourself.
This footnoting part I have already dealt in my paper, which published in the Translation Today journal, volume number 10. Footnoting is also suggested by many people earlier, NIDA and all. They suggested that when there is a technical jargon or cultural items which cannot be translated in the target language, or it is a peculiar thing which is happening in the source language, at that time we need to add or explain in the footnotes. For example, sometime back in the morning session, I think someone asked one question, that is I think Shiny Hazra has asked that question, that pajama is from source language, or what is the source language of pajama? Pajama is available, I think, in Hindi, and in Hindi in India only. I do not know about Urdu. Tariq can add more to that.
It has come to Hindi. It has come to Hindi. Hindi has borrowed it. Hindi has borrowed. No, it is not from Urdu. It is Hindi. It is not from Hindi, because jama refers to cloth, that is of Persian root. Okay.
So it is, but I also added there in the morning session, I have written there that it is also discussed in North America or something like that. I have already written in the morning session. So at that time, when pajama is also already available in the English dictionary.
Now it is included in Oxford dictionary
even
also.
It is available. Yes, that is no problem, absolutely. But we cannot say that it is a peculiar item nowadays, because many items are already gone. Even Vanakam also gone. Even so many things have gone into the dictionary of English dictionary. So footnoting is required at that time when there is a technical or cultural maluse.
Yes, very true, very true. There is a question from Sanjeev Sahu. While translating books written before independence or long ago, one is faced with very casteist, racist, derogatory terms that we know would offend contemporary readers, how to translate faithfully and yet at the same time not to sound offensive or regressive? Very good question, because translators often come across sensitive matters, and these are texts that would be challenging, particularly because of the socio-cultural adages to them, social-cultural baggage they carry. But at the same time, the translator is a person who is acquainted with the cultural nuances. There are requirements of several kinds. A translator can select or opt to transliterate when it is not appropriate to translate. It can be transliterated. Footnotes or explanations can be given. Sometimes, as Professor Yuan Singh had also observed, it can be adapted. That means something of a similar nature existing in the source or the target, in the target language, can be taken up. Or there is also a choice of creating or identifying something, or say using the strategy of euphemization. You will notice that in some languages, for instance, if we are speaking English right now, it may be convenient for us to talk about human body parts, but the moment we take the Indian languages into consideration, it may be slightly restrictive in nature. We may not be able to talk about human body parts that conveniently. So when we visit a doctor, we may opt to use the English terminology with the doctor, especially with respect to the human body parts. So in these situations, there are several options. The translators at times select to euphemize first. Sometimes they use figurative language. That means they would refer to something else talking about this. Okay, so they use metaphors and similes. Okay, and then based on this only, there are two very interesting concepts. If some opportunity permits, we may perhaps discuss that as well. This can happen in the other way also. That means the source text had restrictions, whereas the target text allows you freedom. So there is a concept called explicitation. Okay, and this refers to making a particular thing which was restrictive in the source text more open in the target text, because the culture represented by target text permits you that. So based on that, explicitation or explication, both are there. So, but then again, the translator has to be very careful on these matters. Then we move on to, there is a question on what are translation opportunities in English to Tamil at CIL. We'll come to that later. We'll first take up the other questions. We move on to day number 2, and Tiyesh Ramayatnangam have a doubt regarding JP Postgate, the word diction. I think this was explained there. And then we have Anshuman Bora, who has asked, can self-translation, when the author is also translator, be regarded as a nuance? I have not been able to understand this question very well. We also take into consideration, does it make a difference in translation skill of a person translating in from his native languages or a learned or acquired language? Example, if a native bilingual speaker switching over between both languages translate effortlessly in a normal casual setting, but when it comes to translate in formal setting following linguistic parameters, it may not be fulfilling the desired quality standards. This is by Sneha Gupta, and I fully agree with Sneha on this matter. This is something that we all experience when we have to deliver a talk in our native language. Though we are bilingual, though we very conveniently switch between 2 or 3 languages, but when it comes to speaking formally in an Indian language in our mother tongues, we face difficulties. That is an adjustment problem, and with some training one may be able to do that also, but then it is a challenge. I fully agree with you on this matter. We move on to day 3, where we have Ashish Chavda, and his question is, if the translator already having the source language equivalent word in the target text, and if he still denies to use that word, rather providing domesticated word, so we can say that he's deliberately ignoring to translate the source language text literal word in translation. This question is also not very clear, but whatever I have understood from the question, let me tell you that there are occasions in which the translator has to make a choice between using the source language technical term in the target language or coining a term in the target language. For instance, if you were the translator and you had a text which had the word mobile, so would you translate the word mobile in the language you are translating, or you would like to retain the source term? There are many suggestions related to this. Most scholars agree that it would be appropriate to retain some words which have become very common. So mobile, is it an English word or it is a word belonging to all languages now? Probably most people would agree that this is also an Indian word. Mobile is a Hindi word, it's an Odia word, it's a Kannada word, it's a Malayalam word. So everyone agrees that this is a word of our language. That's one choice. The second choice is to transliterate it. If you agree to the first one, then you transliterate it. That means you will write this word only using the script of the target text. And then the third one is to coin a word. When you coin a word, then you have to depend on several things. The word formation strategy of the target language, dictionaries existing in the target language, and then if a particular term is already coined by some agency, for instance, we have some state bodies, some government designated bodies of technical language, then we have to depend on those designated bodies for coining these terms. If they are not available, then we have to depend on the word formation strategies. But then we have to be very careful, because you can select your strategy, I can select my strategy, somebody else selects his or her own strategy, and we have several terminologies for the same concept, and then that creates a problem if there are so many. So it would be ideal if there is a common agreement on what we are going to call a particular technological term, for instance, SIM card, or for that matter, LPG cylinder, or things like that. Ashish has raised his hand. So Ashish, would you like to speak?
Yes, sir.
Yes, please, Ashish, go ahead.
So, as I have already told you, that if there is still a target word that can a translator use, I mean the literal word that is already available and the literal word that is kind of completely equivalent in terms of the source text, and as he denies to put that word, rather taking liberty by not translating that word literally and putting his own word in kind of as a colloquial word. So, can we say that the translator himself is taking a kind of liberty?
Ashish, whatever I have understood from your question, I feel
Yes.
that translators many times take this liberty. But in the case of those translations which are not commissioned, those translations for which only the translator is interested and not responsible, but if it were a, say, textbook, or if it were a legal text, or if it were something else which is to be vetted by or to be examined by a larger audience, then it would be good for the translator to resist his or her own temptations and follow that which is acceptable by the larger community. So you have a choice there as a scholar. You have a choice whether you keep the author at peace or you keep the reader at peace. So that kind of selection you have to make. Here it would be good to keep the readers at peace, so the translator can take the problem for himself or herself and keep the readers in peace. There is also a question from Yogeshwar Shah, and his question is related to domestication and foreignization, and he is asking which method is better while translating culturally loaded texts. Here, I should like to inform Yogeshwar that domestication and foreignization do not stand as like two competing choices here. Rather, both are equally responsible, and both are equally beneficial for the translators. So when the translator decides to take a local culture or say a local text to the global audience, then of course the text would require some kind of foreignization. And if the translator is bringing a particular global text in a local scenario, then there would be a requirement of domestication. So these are two very diagonally opposite contexts in which domestication and foreignization are used, and these like options are not competing against each other. Rather, these are both utilized depending upon the situations. Then there is a question from Sri Krishna Vaidya, who is inquiring to differentiate between discourse and narrative. Can somebody explain this? Was this discussed? I do not find myself well placed to answer this question. We can revisit this question once we are confident about the answer. So if the question has remained unanswered, we can revisit it. We can invite Dr. Karthika in future, or else I will do some research and then get back to you. Okay. Let us move on to the next question. We have again Sri Krishna Vaidya asking, it is said that translation is a political activity. Please elaborate. This is something very provoking, not just political. If you look at what matter has been translated in past, what matter becomes worthy of translation, and what texts are taken up for translation, you will notice that it is always political. The choice is always political. We can say that no, it is not political, but it is always political in the sense that translators, or say for that matter even authors, are people who are utilizing their intellectual capacity when they are writing or translating. And when somebody is spending time, intellectual abilities in doing something, how is he or she going to get food? How is he or she going to get house and clothes? That means somebody would be sponsoring that. And the moment you notice that there is some kind of a sponsor, some kind of agency that is commissioning the work, then there would be a control also, and that agency or that person who sponsors would select his or her text to be translated. So that is why you'll notice that right from the beginning, whatever translated materials you can find, they are either matters which are of courts. These are like texts which are relevant to the royalties, or these are texts that are relevant to religion. So religious texts, texts that are related to kings, they are not just like taken up randomly. Rather, the institutions want them to be translated, and such decisions are always political. Whether they are good or bad is a separate choice. You and I can differ on that, but they are political. We all will agree on that. Also, even today, you'll notice that if say you will select a particular text for translation, your choice will not be random. You will not just take a book and start translating. You will base your selection on something, and that would be either economic in nature or political in nature, and at times both. So there is again Sanjeev Sahu has posted this question. Classic example of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which he wrote in French, his second language, and then in English, his mother tongue, first language. So these are choice, but then more or less Samuel Beckett, his work Waiting for Godot, I think this is like considered to be a play of English more than French. right? And when it became a play which was performed across the globe, the link was English, the English text, right? So this was a response to Anshuman Bora. It was a response to Anshuman Bora from Sanjeev. We also have Prashant asking narrative is a typo case. Prashant has tried to answer this for the participants. Please go through it. In the meantime, I will have a look at the next question. Then, Kedar Joshi has asked how far sexism in language influences discourse analysis and its product in the form of translation. A very good question which should interest any linguist, not just translators or translation theories. There are several things in our language which are present and they reflect our socio-cultural attitudes, and we unknowingly use them. And only when somebody points at them, we get to know that, oh, this expresses a certain thing which is undesirable or which is culturally very loaded. And then we try to modify ourselves. This is for general language. But when it comes to translation, the translators need to be aware of that, for which the translators will have to know the socio-cultural aspects of language, not just proficiency in the language. Secondly, when he or she is expressing the content in a target language, then he or she will have to again see what is most appropriate in the target language. Bala Bhaskar Kalapatapu has asked, sir, how to make the muhavre as localization for translation. I think muhavre, when you say, or lokokti or kahavat, these are already localized. So when you are translating them in in a next language, there is a big challenge. It is possible for cognate languages to have a similar kind of muhavra or lokokti or kahavat, but it is also possible that a variant may be there. Okay, so if a variant is there, you may use them. At times the variant is similar in nature, at times it's radically different, but then variants are available, because even if we look at the languages of India, we'll notice that most languages that we are using, even though they belong to different families, there is a kind of a cultural unity that binds us all of us together. And because of that, a lot of proverbs that we use, a lot of lokokti and muhavres that we are bringing in our day-to-day use, they have similarity. They have similarity in nature. At times, there may be something missing. For instance, if a Kashmiri comes out and says that today the snow that fell was black in color. Now, when snow does not fall in several parts of the country, they may not be having a proverb that says about snow, but there can be some other phenomena which is regularly occurring in that particular culture, and a pattern of that linguistic expression can be found there. Such things are challenging, but then equivalents, like we find equivalents for terminologies, terms, equivalents for proverbs, which are like larger texts, which are strings of words, can also be found. The challenge is before the translators. There is an interesting question here. What about the challenges in translating from and to a diglossic language like Tamil? Are there any theories which deal with this? Again, this is a question of very high interest for linguists. But for those participants who do not have exposure to linguistics, let me first tell them what diglossic languages are, what diglossia means. Okay, diglossic languages are those languages in which you have two functionally separate varieties. Functionally separate means one variety will be used in one particular situation, and the other variety will be used in another particular situation. This is not similar to academic discourse. If you were my friend and I were talking to you in a casual manner, I may use a particular style. And when I'm talking to you formally in a classroom or in an office, my style may be different. this is not diglossic. This is just two varieties, formal and informal usages. But diglossic languages have varieties which are functionally separate in the sense that when you have, for instance, puja going on, a prayer, then you use a particular variety, and when you have day-to-day communication, you use another variety. So Tamil is an excellent example in India that provides diglossic situations. When you have Sen Tamil and Kon Tamil, and the two varieties differ, they are like functionally separate. You have another like good example from Arabic where you have Al-Fusha and Al-Ammiya, which are two very functionally separate varieties. You have in Bangla, Sadhu Bangla and Chalit Bangla, or in Telugu you have Vyavaharika and Grantrika. These are like functionally separate varieties. What happens in these varieties is you use one variety for a specified function and you call it high variety. Okay, that is called high variety because its function is located, it is fixed, and the other variety is low variety, and that is for day-to-day use. The high variety requires formal training always. It is also important that the high variety requires formal training. So one can learn the high variety only by receiving formal education, whereas the low variety is learned at home from day-to-day communication. So this was about the general aspects of diglossic languages. Now it is about the, our challenge is how to translate from one variety of a diglossic language to another variety of diglossic language. My point is a lot of these things are already done in the sense that in diglossic languages, the high variety influences the low variety in such a way that most of the content of the high variety is already existing in a simplified form in the low variety. For instance, we can read our Vedas and then discuss about them in general day-to-day language. Okay, but we very well know that they are existing in a different language in the scriptures, right? So when you are reading the scriptures, the content is available in some way. Then we discuss the same thing in our day-to-day conversations and we bring them into practice. Okay, and we say that we are following this thing without acknowledging the Vedas. So that way, the knowledge of that or the contents have already like transcended to the day-to-day language usages. Somewhere people are aware of it. When it has to be translated, then the accepted formal structures will have to be taken into consideration. It may not be appropriate to just re-quote or just use the same kind of language here, which creates some kind of gap. So the purpose here should be communicative. That means if the translator is translating a higher variety to the lower variety, there would not be a requirement of translating a lower variety to the higher variety. If that happens, I do not know. Sometimes some creative writers do that, like they are, or some writers do it in an ironical or sarcastic writing also, when they want to like criticize the policies or when they want to abuse a friend, they use a very glorifying style, but they are using choicy words which were like commonly used in the regular form. So that way, I mean, you have choices. Let me come back to the questions again. We have very little time remaining. I think we have already jumped time. Can we translate the source language into regional dialects like Angika, which has no such influence and recognition? How effective that's going to be and how badly it is in this time? This is also a very good question. Let me inform to the participants that Angika is a language spoken in Bihar, especially in that part of Bihar, which is called Magad region. And Angika is a language very similar to Maghi and Maithili. So when you have two larger languages placed side by side or placed on both sides of a smaller language, then that language will receive less attention. And that is why you'll have less of standardization of that language. But then when translation has to happen in that kind of a language, the first question that a translator should think, or any language that comes to the translator in a similar way, like the language is less recognized, it is lesser known, or it is not written, or it is less resourced, then the translator should first identify one question before taking up the text. The purpose of translation, the purpose is to communicate. So if the purpose is to communicate certain content from the source to the target language, then the translator's work is half done. And then I believe any language, whether it's small, recognized, minor, major, whatsoever, okay, any language is capable of expressing anything. So all languages have the power to express every content, every knowledge that we are talking about, every subject that we have. So that way, if it is a question of Angika, and if our text available in a major language is to be expressed in a language called Angika, it is not impossible. It is difficult because some words may not be available, because some expressions may be difficult, because there is no trend of such discourses in that language. I understand, but then there is nothing that cannot be expressed there, because politics is discussed in those languages, culture or movies or other fashion, several other things are discussed in those languages. So when all other discussions can happen, why translation cannot happen? It is possible. The only thing is that the translator will choose between whether the translator is fully translating into that language and speaking everything, or the translator is using a bilingual format where some of the words for which it would not be appropriate to translate, the translator uses transliteration. Instead of translating them or coining new terms, the translator opts for transliteration. So Prashant Kumar is mentioning that he is a native speaker of Angika. Very happy that Prashant is present here. And I should like to inform Prashant that I understand Angika almost fully. I understand Maghi also, and my native place is somewhere near to the Angika and Maghi speaking areas. But I do not speak Angika, but I understand it. Then we move on to other questions. I agree that while translating even a text from olden days, we have to make it relevant for the present day readers. Major issues is with creating intelligible vocabulary for the present readers. Please guide in this concern. It's a very relevant question, because even if the content can be expressed in the language, the problem, the difficulties arise especially with respect to the technical terms. So what do we do for that? Do we create new terms and make the text very unreadable, or we use the source language technical terms in the target language and allow some level of bilingualism in the target language? I think this choice can best be made by the translator himself or herself, based on the perception of the task, based on the perception of the text, based on the perception of the target users. And there can be a very healthy situation when you have some words transliterated, especially those terminologies which would be best suitable in their source form. For instance, if it's a text of chemistry and you are unnecessarily coining new terms just to provide an equivalent, I think it is better to use the source term itself and then allow the target readers to read it in the source language and get to know what exactly it means. At this point, I would like to thank all the participants who joined for this interactive session. We shall be holding one more interactive session in the next week, where we discuss some of the questions that remained unanswered during the talks. And if there is any question that remained unanswered today, we will take up those questions also. And in that interactive session, we'll keep some time, especially to discuss books. And then I will introduce a few things before you when we talk about books. Thank you, everyone, especially Professor Vinod Jha, for joining us today. and thank you all the participants for making this session fruitful